This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Howling and half-naked in his torn and bloody clothing, Fargo is a desperate man and dangerous to himself and others. He ricochets around his kitchen, heaving furniture into the street. The street is 12 stories down, and Fargo fills the New York air with chairs and tables, lamps and dishes, cutting boards and cabinets, electric fans and plastic caddies, frying pans and double boilers, brooms and mops and metal buckets, canned goods and Pyrex platters, a garbage can, a cookie jar, a toaster oven, even the refrigerator door which he rips off and throws out the window. The door sails through the air like a giant frisbee filled with condiments and lands in the middle of 102nd Street and shatters, hurling mustard, ketchup, mayo, cheese, and relish everywhere. A man standing in the crowd that has gathered across the street to celebrate this mad defenestration snatches up a package of Velveeta cheese and holds it aloft. "Hey, pal, don't forget the fucking bread." Fargo heaves the bread box out the window and charges through the pantry past the back door into the living room. He continues to delight the crowd by smashing up and throwing out lamps and chairs, books and dishes, mirrors and paintings, bicycles and bottles, records and clothing, 2 radios, 1 TV, 3 boxes filled with family photos, 2 love seats, a framed map of the state of Mississippi, a broken stereo, 6 TV tables, a 250-gallon aquarium filled with old sneakers, a closet door, an ironing board, a wedding ring. "Where was Fargo's wife?" I said. "Fargo's wife was on the town." "Doing what?" "Having fun, I hope. Who can blame her, anyhow?" "Why was Fargo weeping so?" Fargo looked around wildly. He was hearing voices again. Rule number 1, you talk to me, I talk to you. He could feel his head expanding like a hot air balloon, swelling and bursting at the seams. Fargo laughed, and then he cried. He tried with all his might to push his face back into shape, but his hands were wet and slippery. Fargo was losing his grip. There was blood on his hands. There was blood on the floor. Then the dogs began to howl. Fargo found himself running down a long hallway. It was a dark passage lined with thousands of books. These books were in his head, the education of a lunatic, but all the knowledge in the world seemed useless now. The books were silent and unhelpful, a cavern of collected grief, as if 1,000 mouths all crying woe had gathered here and then been shut. Fargo ran through the dark. The silence was terrifying. Fact: a wound is a mouth without a tongue. He burst into the bathroom. The light was bright and iridescent. The cries of the crowd rose to meet him like a flock of slashing birds. No more silence now. It was Baudelaire who said, "I have felt the wind of the wing of madness." But Fargo knew exactly what to do. He lunged across the bathroom and ripped the gleaming white enamel cover off the back of the toilet and brought its full weight crashing down against the sink again and again, smashing it. The sink buckled, tearing loose from the wall, bursting pipes, spewing water everywhere, spraying the walls, soaking the floor. Fargo spun around and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He was panting for breath, dripping with blood and sweat. He looked like a maniac, but he knew how to fix that. Did Fargo have a plan? Not exactly, no. How about a tool? Sorry, no tool. Technique? You must be joking. What about a plot? Certainly not. Fargo yanked the mirror from the wall and threw it into the hallway. Then he jerked the window open and looked down at the crowd, which was growing larger and more festive by the minute. The crowd roared its approval. They were glad to see him, but Fargo was in no mood to make friends. He slammed the window shut and drove his fist through the pane, sending a shower of glass crashing toward the crowd below. "Fuck you, motherfuckers! Fuck you!" The crowd cheered again, and somewhere in the dark and tumbling reaches of Fargo's whirling brain, it struck him that he had never felt so satisfied in all his life, or so sad, so bewildered, so lost, or so completely free. Fargo climbed into the bathtub awash in blood and sweat, and proceeded with a violence that was both frenzied and methodical to punch his way into the wall. He tore out ancient tubes and pipes, some of which were glutinous and green from years of dry rot and festering mold. slimed over with rat droppings and a fine paste of dead roaches, and flung them into the night like a mad monarch flinging jewels out the palace window to the mob. The mob roared with pleasure. Two ragtag teenage boys picked up a twisted pair of copper pipes and, swinging them flashing in the air like bright batons above their heads, began to hammer out a fierce staccato beat on the back of an upturned garbage can. A short, bow-legged lady, with a white round face smeared all over with bright red rouge, wrapped herself in the slimy shower curtain and capered through the crowd, shouting out with glee, "Throw yourself out, mister. We'll catch you if we can." Did Fargo comply? No, sir, he did not. Why not? Fargo Burns was not prepared to kill himself or even die, at least not yet. He seemed determined to demolish inanimate objects only. He was the exact opposite of a neutron bomb, annihilating lifeless matter everywhere and leaving everything alive alone. For example, his children. His children were alive, but Fargo had forgotten them. They were hiding in a distant corner of the dark apartment, listening fearfully to every curse, every cry, every bellow of the beast, until it finally came to this: midnight. Holly opened the back door and found her husband crawling on the glistening floor like some creature in a fairy tale who has been placed under a terrible spell and turned into a farmyard beast. Fargo was covered with blood, slippery as a butchered pig. Holly held him close, trying to calm him down. He thrashed and struggled in her arms until they fell to the floor in a bed of broken glass. Then they clung to one another desperately, like the last remaining sailors on a sinking ship, and wept. They lay on the floor together a long time, rocking back and forth, and sobbing quietly, and then more quietly, and then more quietly still, until finally they were calm, or if not calm, then spent. They continued to cling to one another with a tenderness, a gentleness that had long been absent from their marriage. It was as if they had found here in the wreckage all around them a kind of memento, a broken fragment, a bloody shard of their once formidable but now exhausted regard for one another. It was as if they had returned, the two of them, as if they had returned ever so briefly to the kind of ardor, the kind of sweet concern for one another that had first ignited, then sustained their friendship down the years. Wrapped in the safety of these feelings, Fargo and Holly continued rocking back and forth in one another's arms, slowly rocking like a pair of children trying to comfort one another, until Holly, with a look of wild alarm, let out a cry and pointed across the room. Fargo turned in time to see the back door, which opened onto the outer hallway, and which Holly had apparently neglected to close, dissolve into a dark blue surge, like an ocean wave rising up under a black light, and then give way before a solid mass of burly flesh. The room filled up with cops. There were 10 policemen in all, powerful and polite, strapping fellows with friendly faces weaving slowly in and out of Fargo's broken focus like enormous blue cartoons. "What's the story here?" said one of the cops. "Story?" said Fargo. "Yeah, what's happening here?" "Oh my God," said Holly. "Jesus Christ." Fargo and Holly staggered to their feet, rising out of the rubble that surrounded them like survivors of a car crash, both of them speckled with bits and pieces of broken glass. Fargo was crisscrossed with tiny cuts and deep gashes, and he and Holly were stained with his blood. It looked like, and indeed it was, a scene of total devastation, the grim aftermath of a psychotic break that had left both of them looking battered and bruised. Fargo was bewildered. There was blood on his hands. There was blood on the floor. 2 of the cops led Holly into the kitchen while the others stayed with Fargo to see if they could calm him down. They gave him cigarettes. Fargo smoked and tried without success to make sense of what had happened. His 3 children came into the living room, stumbling toward him through the debris. On their faces, apprehension and alarm, but something else as well, some kind of curious mix of horror and amusement, as if they had already registered in their quick and watchful minds the undeniable fact that this night of fearful, inexplicable misery and violence had also been a night of astonishing drama, a night they would never be allowed to forget, a night that would feed their fears and anecdotes for many years to come. They begged the police not to take their father away. They said over and over again he would never hurt them. But the police were non-committal. They looked on quietly, forming a skeptical but nonetheless respectful semicircle, like so many agnostics at a christening. Fargo wrapped his bloody arms around his terrified children and held them so close they could barely breathe. The dogs began to bark again. The children were afraid. Fargo told them over and over that he was sorry, he was sorry, he was sorry, and that was certainly true, but he was crazy anyhow, not to mention desperate, dangerous, and frightened. The cops were patient and calm. Fargo was utterly confounded, like someone coming out of anesthesia. One of the cops took the children into the kitchen to be with Holly, while the others walked Fargo out of the apartment into the hallway. Fargo stared about him in a state of complete confusion, and then he thought he heard somebody say, "Maybe she don't love you, mister. Maybe you feel black and blue." "I do," he said. "It's true." "Maybe you should come with us," they said, "and lay your weary head upon a pallet bleak and drear." "Bullshit," I said. "Who said that?" "I did." "Who?" Fargo lowered his head and said quietly, so quietly that his words were barely audible, "What have I done? I don't know what I've done." "You kind of messed things up here," said one of the cops. "Big time," said another. "What about the children?" said Fargo. "They're okay. I wouldn't worry about them if I were you." "Can I see them?" "Not now, no. Maybe later." Fargo covered his eyes. He could see his hands, but not his kids. The dogs began to bark again. He uncovered his eyes and said, "Later?" "Here, have another cigarette." "My name is Fargo Burns," I said. "Maybe you should see a doctor." "I want to see my kids," said Fargo. "I want to talk to them." Someone handed Fargo a cigarette. The cigarette was soaking wet. "This cigarette is wet," I said. He threw the cigarette away and started punching holes in the wall, slamming his fist into the plaster again and again. His hands began to bleed. The cops watched him silently and carefully, but without apparent emotion. Fargo dropped his hands to his sides and spun away from the bloody wall. He looked around wildly. Where was he? Who were they? The cops continued to watch him carefully, their hands resting lightly on their weapons. In Fargo's twisted mind, they had taken on a menacing, Teutonic look. They had guns and they had clubs. Fargo noticed a fire extinguisher hanging on the wall a few feet away. It seemed to him that he had never seen it there before. He thought, "I need to get to Paris, then I'll be all right." He lunged across the hall and ripped the fire extinguisher out of its thin aluminum frame. The cops backed away, prepared for the worst. He turned and threw the fire extinguisher over the banister and down the stairs. The heavy metal canister hit the wall and bounced across the landing. "Paris burns," he cried. An unspoken but powerful signal, born of years of experience, passed among the cops, and they began to close in on Fargo, but carefully, warily, like hunters closing on a wounded lion. Fargo raised both hands overhead like a mad evangelist and roared, "There is nothing wrong with my appendix." The cops stopped and looked at one another. Then one of them laughed harshly and said, "Somebody better throw a net over this crazy son of a bitch before I shoot him." A powerful and wide gentleman came from the local deli with a straitjacket and wrapped Fargo tight. "Paris burns," he said, and then he said, "There is nothing wrong with my appendix." And then they carried him away, and you could hear his cries of rage or grief, whatever they were, for blocks and blocks. "Did they pack him in ice?" I said. "No, sir, they did not. They gave him a shot instead." He drifted away and sang, "Talk about happy, I'll be happy when I lay my burden down."
That was Fargo Burns, written and read by Kostmayer. This story is the first chapter of the novel Fargo Burns by Kostmayer, published by Dr. Cicero Books in 2020.
Hello, Kos. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
That's a remarkable first chapter of a novel. Just the opening paragraph makes the reader hit the ground running. Is it important to you to maintain that kind of manic energy as an expression of the character's own intensity?
Well, the character is mostly manic. He's been compared to a pinball that's crashing around in a machine that's on tilt and sort of bouncing back and forth between sobriety and excess and his attempt to find some kind of stability and peace in his life. So his rhythm is a determining factor in the book throughout. But the rhythms change because the location changes. Sometimes he's in New York City at a certain age and out of control and having real struggles with his mental health and his life in general. Other times he's living in the Deep South and he's a child. And there's a different kind of rhythm in the Deep South, obviously, than there is in New York City. So rhythm is essential to my reading of my work itself. And but it doesn't have to always be manic, but it's certainly manic at the very beginning.
Yes, it is. The violence of the imagery, things being hurled from a New York apartment window, has a cinematic feel. I know you're not only a novelist, but a screenwriter, poet, and playwright. When you write fiction, are you conscious of that cinematic element?
I don't think I'm conscious of the cinematic element that the book may or may not contain or convey. Mm-hmm. But there's no question that my work in film, primarily working in cutting rooms with editors, and my work as a playwright, where you're fashioning a kind of drama that has to be delivered live and often through dialogue, and poetry itself. Those three different forms have influenced my work considerably. Mm-hmm. I think the basis of my work primarily is poetry because of its condensation, because of its ability to accelerate and make leaps and changes and shifts that are surprising and perhaps not always to be expected. So although I'm not looking for or trying to develop a cinematic feel in the book, there's no question that my work in film and my love of film in general and its ability to shift time and place spontaneously and quickly and surprisingly has influenced my writing.
As Brent mentioned, you write in many forms. Does any one of those take precedence, or are they all equal for you?
No, they're not all equal. I made my living for many years writing in Hollywood, writing for television and film in Hollywood, and it afforded me an opportunity to make a really good living, which is never an easy thing for a writer to do.
No.
But it wasn't the kind of work finally I wanted to do or needed to do. So my love is for novels, poems, and plays, and those are the forms in which I'm happiest and in which I feel freest and which I feel most qualified to make some kind of contribution to the conversation that all of us are having, all of us who are writing and reading and thinking about these issues are having. So I do think, and I may have said this earlier, that poetry is a sort of a foundational factor for me because of its condensation. And, Joseph Brodsky defined poetry as accelerated intelligence. And I don't think he meant by that poets are smarter than other people. I think he meant that it is able to move at a certain kind of speed and to make leaps, and the leaps themselves speed up the process. So I think that's an important part of my work. But no, they're not all equal for me. The one that's of least interesting to me, but was certainly the most profitable, is screenwriting.
Well, getting back to Fargo Burns, I noticed the occurrence every now and then of the first-person pronoun in this chapter, and even a dialogue with another unnamed person. So who is this I? An omniscient narrator, a character in the story, Fargo himself?
Well, he's certainly a voice in the story. And I myself don't really know the answer to that question. I think I really prefer for the reader to wrestle with it and answer it for himself or herself.
Uh-huh.
It's entirely possible that the voices that clatter around in Fargo's mind and the voices he hears and the confusion he experiences sometimes expresses itself in the first person.
Yeah.
It could be something he's hearing. Somebody else could be saying it. He could be thinking it. But that voice is kind of a free-floating element, a kind of an improvisational element on the theme of Fargo's madness and of his disintegration and of his delirium. And so in that delirium, all sorts of voices, all sorts of sounds are being heard, and that's just one of them, and it happens to be in the first person. But I don't really have a simple answer to the question. I'm not trying to be evasive. I myself prefer to leave the question unanswered and let the reader make up his or her own mind.
Could you give us a brief description of the book beyond this first chapter, without giving away too much, of course?
Well, Fargo is obviously in a lot of trouble right from the beginning. He's having what some people refer to as a psychotic break. And the book follows his attempt to find some stability, some peace in his life, a place where he can ground himself and make sense of his place in the world and be a better father and be a better person. It's a long, hard struggle for him, and he does get involved as the book unfolds with a beautiful young woman, and they have a passionate affair. And unfortunately for Fargo, she is the girlfriend of a hired killer, a professional assassin. And obviously it's a judgment that is going to, a decision he makes to give way to his desires that is going to lead to problems for Fargo. And I think that's about as much as I know how to say. It's really a book about his quest, his search for peace, and he's looking in the most troubled place of all, which is his own life, his own soul. And he does a good many things that aggravate his problems rather than resolve them.
Okay.
Can I say one thing else about this?
Sure.
And maybe we're coming to this later, I'm not sure, but I think Fargo's lunacy, his madness, his delirium, also the great pleasure he takes in life, is sort of reflective of the time in which this book is set, which is the late 60s, early 70s in New York City, at the height of the Vietnam War, at the height of the sort of the frenzy and the political upheaval that we associate with the 60s, and the music and the drugs and the excitement of all that. So I think his personality and the book itself are partly shaped by the times in which he lives.
Well, you certainly capture a very particular flavor of New York at that time. I think Fargo Burns might even be considered a classic New York novel. I imagine you lived in the city at that time. I
did live in the city at that time, and did tend bar and work in bars and restaurants in that time. And certainly there are two prevailing rhythms in my work, and they are also the prevailing rhythms of my history, my life. And one is the rhythm of the Deep South, where I was born. I was born in New Orleans and have lived a good portion of my life in the Deep South. And I grew up in a Southern family, but largely in and around New York City. So that the rhythm and the vitality and the excitement and the quick-hitting changes that we associate with New York City, that kind of sense of humor, that kind of irony, that kind of sarcasm, that kind of speed and acceleration are just built into my DNA. I grew up in New York City, and New York. I consider myself a New Yorker, but there's no question that the rhythms and the Deep South are also a part of my who I am as a person and who I am as a writer. But that time in New York City was exciting to me. It was tumultuous. There was revolution in the air. There was sexual liberation in the air. There were drugs in the air and in our bodies. And so, I love New York City, and I think my feeling for it and my history there is evident in the book. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Do you see Fargo as a hero or an anti-hero, or do such distinctions matter to you?
They don't really enter my mind, to tell you the truth. And I certainly don't see him as a hero. I guess I don't see him as a hero or an anti-hero. I do see him as someone who is genuinely struggling to be a better person and making some choices along the way which make that struggle more difficult, more complex. And I think his quest for peace, for some kind of stability, is what's propelling him forward. But he's full of impulses and desires and needs that sometimes are at odds with his search for stability. But I don't think of him as being heroic. I think of him as being full of life. He's got a lot of energy. He's got a lot of zest. He's got the ability to laugh and to enjoy life and to enjoy all aspects of life. But he's too troubled and too confused, too bewildered by himself and by the world in which he lives to play the role of either a full-fledged hero or a full-fledged anti-hero.
Okay.
Well, you don't have to take this question seriously if you don't want to, as it's overly voyeuristic. But sometimes readers like to mistakenly speculate. So is there an element of autobiography in this opening scene?
Yes. Mm-hmm. There is an element of biography in the book. And I would say two things about that. I think anyone who reads Fargo Burns is going to recognize or at least suspect that there's some sort of autobiographical element that runs throughout the narrative, and that's exactly right. There is. But every scene, whether it's the opening scene or any other scene in the book, even if it's directly autobiographical, even if I myself, the writer, said this or did this, committed this act or made this comment, every scene is transfigured by at least two elements. One is my imagination, and the other is language itself.
Right.
Language often leads me, and as it does most writers, I assume, leads me into places where I had not expected to go before. It alters and colors the scene. It leads to discoveries and surprises which transform the material for better or worse. And of course, one's imagination, which is so free and so indifferent to rules and regulations, and so ready to embrace the undiscovered and the new, plays a big part in every scene. So that, yes, there's an autobiographical element. I wouldn't want to pick out the scenes that are most autobiographical or least autobiographical, because in the end, it's all fiction, it's all soup, it's all the ingredients blended into a single event, a single phenomenon we call the novel.
Yes.
When you write such a story as this, are you consciously trying to make a point, divulging a certain philosophy of life, or do you just follow where the story leads?
I think I follow where the story, where the character, where my imagination, and where language itself leads. When I sat down to write Fargo Burns, I didn't know what I was going to write. I did write the first paragraph, which has remained pretty much unchanged through multiple drafts, but that's as much as I knew. I started with that opening scene, the one we've talked about here today and the one we've recorded here today. And then I allowed myself to discover everything as I went along. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm a helpless observer or I'm like a passenger on a ship that someone else is steering, but the process of creating and inventing and being surprised and surprising myself is a big part of my work. And I certainly don't start out with a philosophical point in mind, but I start out with issues that concern me, and some of those are philosophical or political or social or sexual or psychological or chemical. And I want to wrestle with some of those issues and some of those questions I have in my mind. But I don't start out to make a point. I don't think my initial approach is didactic by any means.
Fargo Burns was published in 2020 by Dr. Cicero Books, an independent publisher, which is something close to my heart as we have our own imprint, Recital Publishing. Can you say a little about your experience in that regard and your thoughts on the role of small publishers these days?
My experience has been wonderful, partly because Dr. Cicero Books and the people who own and operate Dr. Cicero Books are wonderful. Its primary founder is Carrie Harrison, who lives here in Woodstock, by the way. And among other things, Carrie is a really extraordinary writer. He's a truly great writer, in my opinion, so that he has an understanding of writing and writers that you might not encounter at every publishing house. And I assume that the same thing is true at Strange Recital. And so working with Carrie and working with his colleagues at Dr. Cicero Books has been a great treat for me. For one thing, I'm free. I'm free to write what I want to write and however I want to write it. And they are eager to let the writer follow his own instincts, his own impulses, and make his or her mistakes and make his or her contributions. And so I really relish the freedom, which is exactly the opposite of the experience, of course, I had in Hollywood, where I was paid well, but I was really paid to do other people's bidding. Here I'm allowed to do my own bidding. So I've loved the experience. I think, like most writers who are published by small independent presses, you realize there are some activities that might be available through a larger publishing house, funds for marketing, publicity, tours, that sort of thing, which might not be readily available through a small independent publishing house. But I have not felt any loss. It's been a very happy experience with me, and working closely with Carrie Harrison has been a joy, and I've loved it.
Great.
Out of interest, Don Quixote is sometimes cited as the first European novel, though the history of the novel in Europe might stretch back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. It might be the first printed European novel, but then, of course, there are Chinese and Japanese novels which predate Don Quixote. So, what do you think is the future of the novel, if there is one? Do people read less these days?
I don't know the answer to the second part of the question. I don't know if people read less, although it's my impression that they read less. Maybe that's because when I ride the subway, I'm one of the few people still reading books while other people are reading their cell phone. But who knows? Maybe they're reading Tolstoy on their cell phone. So I do think that the novel once occupied a central place in our culture, and in some ways was sort of the dominant cultural artifact around which people collected their ideas and their thoughts and their responses to the culture at large. I don't think it occupies that central place any longer. I think the whole culture is fragmented in that way. But I think people will always read. I think there is a certain kind of pleasure available to us through novels. You know, Borges said that reading is like thinking with someone else's mind. And that's an opportunity that a novel affords us. We get to experience the world through the mind of someone else. And I think it can be an exhilarating experience. So I think that the future of the novel may be that it won't occupy the central place it once occupied, but that it will share that space with other art forms and continue to have a really rich role to play in our lives. I can't imagine a world without books, without literature, without reading, and I won't be here if that world arrives, so I won't have to experience it.
Yeah, I think in some ways fiction might be an evolutionary adaptation, you know?
Well, I want to comment on that because I think that's very smart and I think it's very true. And I think that one of the things that people, all of us, can sometimes lose sight of is what does the word novel mean? It only means new. It doesn't mean anything else. And of course, in other languages, they have another word for fiction. But here in English, we call it the novel. And it just means something new, something previously undiscovered or unknown or something previously not experienced. And I think that means that it's forever open to new ways of being implemented, new ways of being created, new ways of being crafted. So I think there's a sort of a bright possibility there that I think you've just expressed much more succinctly than I, that it's evolutionary and that the novel can change and evolve and become a whole different kind of instrument going forward. And that's one of the things I've always liked about jazz, is that improvisational nature, the idea that you discover in the process what it is you want to create, and then you create almost hand in hand with the impulses that are driving you forward. So I think you've said something true and accurate, and it makes me feel good to hear it.
Well, great. And on that note, we'll have to end. So thanks for talking with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, thank you, Kos.
Thank you.
This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Bebop by Nicola Chiantaroli Trio. This is episode 21101.